This week on the EIE radio broadcast, how can we as Christians run to win?
Welcome to EIE Radio, encouraging, inspiring, and equipping Christians to stand for truth and reach the lost. Now, here's your host, Neil Hess.
Welcome to this week's edition of the EIE radio broadcast, and I'm going to be addressing how can we run to win? This question was submitted by Eric on the Facebook page, and I really thought it would be good for us to go over as just a sort of practical way to look at how Christians are supposed to live and how we can largely discipline ourselves and endure. Before we get into that, though, I wanted to say thank you to a special anonymous donor who blessed me tremendously over the past couple of weeks by supplying me with a couple of needs for the ministry for hardware and software purposes. So I don't want to say the person's name, but you know who you are. Thank you so much, and I really, really appreciate it. And also, for those of you out there, I want to hear about ministries and Christians that inspire you, or authors, or apologists, or evangelists, or whatever else. I'm finding that while I'm no expert in this field, at least not compared to a whole lot of people, I'm finding that it has been so encouraging for me to be able to sit down with experts and to pick their brain about these issues that we all end up facing down the road at some point. So if you have people that you really think would be good for me to interview or good to talk to or good to just show off what they're doing for the kingdom of God, I would love to hear about it. Please send me an email, eieradiomail@gmail.com. So I wanted to read through this passage here. It's 1 Corinthians 9, verses 24 through 27, and I'm going to be reading out of the NLT just because I feel that that's probably the most easily understood for Americans in today's church. So starting at verse 24, Paul's saying, "Don't you realize that in a race everyone runs, but only one person gets the prize? So run to win. All athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away, but we do it for an eternal prize. So I run with purpose in every step, and I'm not just shadowboxing. I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified." And Chris on the Facebook page had this to say about this topic, and I just wanted to get his comment out there real quick. So Chris says, "As a runner, I can tell you that running to win doesn't happen only on race day. Training is mandatory if you are to even have a hope of winning. Training isn't just running longer distances or faster speeds, but also includes proper sleep and eating habits. Simply put, running to win literally requires discipline to change your entire life on purpose to win the prize." And I would certainly agree with that, especially for Christian living in general. So real quick, just as far as running a race in Paul's time, when it wasn't really a Jewish tradition, at least not as far as I understand, but it was more of a Greek custom. And the Greeks and the Romans, as we all know, were big into the gladiatorial games, the arena games, things like that, and running races was certainly a part of that. As you know, the marathon was coined, I believe, by the Greek runner Marathon. I found this quote about running from the Commentary Critical and Explanatory on the Whole Bible, put out by Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown in 1997. It says, "These periodical games were to the Greeks rather a passion than a mere amusement." So we might think of cross-country running or sprinting or something like that as something to go watch, like, ooh, look at them run, especially down in Eugene, Oregon, which is about an hour and a half south where I live. Running's a big thing down there. But this was more than just an amusement. This was a passion. This was something that people devoted their entire lives to. And so I think we need to also ask, what does winning mean here? Paul says that we should run to win, not necessarily running to finish. And I think there is a distinction there that's important to pay attention to. It sounds like winning is more than just being saved. It's something else. It's not just striving to enter heaven, but it's striving to enter heaven with momentum and with purpose, and just with exhausting ourselves of all that we have to glorify God and to radically obey Him in our lives. So from the same commentary I just mentioned a moment ago, and all these notes will be in the show notes as well if you want to take a look at these. I want to read this paragraph for you. "These are the words in which the instructor of the young in the exercise school, gymnasia, and the spectators on the race course exhorted their pupils to stimulate them to put forth all exertions. The gymnasium was a prominent feature in every Greek city. Every candidate had to take an oath that he had been 10 months in training and that he would violate none of the regulations. He lived on a strict self-denying diet, refraining from wine and pleasant foods, and enduring cold and heat and the most laborious discipline. The prize, awarded by the judge or umpire, was a chaplet, I believe that's how it's pronounced, of green leaves. At the isthmus, those of the indigenous pine for which parsley leaves were temporarily substituted. The Greek for obtain is fully obtain, so it's beyond just, yeah, I got it. It's to really get it with gusto, to fully achieve, to fully get what it is you're getting, and not just having it handed to you. It is in vain to begin unless we persevere to the end. The so expresses run with such perseverance in the heavenly course as all the runners exhibit in the earthly race just spoken of, to the end that ye may attain the prize. So here it's again just reiterating the same point, that it's not just finishing, it's giving your whole body and your whole soul to it. Running here required discipline and honor, and it's shown in the oath and the focus in which these men would put forward for 10 or more months. And then moving on now, there's another quote I found. It says, "There is room for all to get the prize. You cannot fail if you run well. Yet there should be a noble emulation. You should endeavor to outdo one another. And it is a glorious contest who shall get first to heaven or have the best rewards in that blessed world. I make it my endeavor to run, so do you, as you see me go before you." And that was from Matthew Henry's commentary on the whole Bible. And there was one sentence in there that really stuck out to me. "Yet there should be a noble emulation. You should endeavor to outdo one another." So it sounds here like Matthew Henry is actually exhorting us to compete with each other, like who can outgive who, and not for pride's sake necessarily, but just for, let's aspire to do so many good things. It's like a friendly competition where we're trying to do as best we can, but not so we can look at the other man and say, hey, I'm better than him, but to spur each other on to good works and to encourage each other to really fully break through the tape, as it were, with all the momentum and speed and passion that we possibly can. So it was really interesting for me here to see that Matthew Henry really saw the competition as a positive motivator, whereas competition, I think, in a large segment, especially in America these days, competition is like, oh, well, one person has to feel bad if they lose, and let's not do that. Everybody gets a trophy, everybody gets a merit badge, every student of the month. Competition here is really spoken of as a positive thing. Another quote, "Those that ran in the games were kept to a set diet. Every man that strives for the mastery is temperate in all things. The fighters and wrestlers in your exercise are kept to a strict diet and discipline, nay, they keep themselves to it. They do not indulge themselves, but restrain themselves from the food they eat, and so from the liberties they use on other occasions." So there's a point of emphasis here where they're not indulging. They're not taking these liberties that they have to bask in pleasure or to enjoy themselves. They're denying themselves of these things, even though they have a right to them, because their eyes are focused on the finish line, on the crown of glory that believers are wanting to achieve, that we're all wanting to hear when we get to the end of our lives and hear Christ say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." I know that's the aspiration of my life. I can't wait for that day. Continuing on, "And should not Christians much more abridge themselves of their liberty for so glorious an end as winning the race and obtaining the prize set before them? They used a very spare diet and coarse food, and denied themselves much to prepare for their race and combat. So do I. So should you, after my example. It is hard if for the heavenly crown you cannot abstain from heathen sacrifices. They were not only temperate, but inured themselves to hardships." So they actually, it's almost like they almost sought out these hardships. It's like they were purposefully understanding that these hardships would produce endurance. As it talks about in the scriptures, we see, the verse isn't coming to mind right now, but endurance produces faith. I believe that's in James or Peter. I can't remember off the top of my head. Those who fought with one another in these exercises prepared themselves by beating the air as the apostle calls it, or by throwing out their arms and thereby injuring themselves beforehand, to deal about their blows in close combat or brandish themselves by way of flourish. There is no room for any such exercise in Christian warfare. Christians are ever in close combat. The enemies make fierce and hearty opposition and are ever at hand, and for this reason they must lay about them in earnest and never drop the contest, nor flag and faint in it. So, whereas athletes might have a set period of time where they're training or persevering or pushing through or what have you, the Christian life is a continual battle. And I think, especially just speaking from a man's point of view, in a society where scantily clad women are found around every corner, or at least pictures of them are around every corner, I think that constant battle is very real for Christians who desire to be without sin, who desire to sin as little as possible. And, certainly there are other temptations in the American life too, such as materialism, alcohol, not that alcohol itself is a sin, but the overuse of it, eating habits, exercise habits, which I am not the standard of whatsoever. But there are a lot of things, and these are coming at us 24/7, through television or through the internet or through talking to people or whatever else. It is a constant battle. We don't have the luxury that these runners had, where they had an off season, or they could say, well, I'm not going to do it this year, and they didn't have to worry about it. We have to endure these things 24/7, 365, until the very end, until the very last breath we breathe. And that's tough. That is incredibly difficult. Continuing on. They must fight not as those that beat the air, but must strive against their enemies with all their might. One enemy the apostle here mentions, namely the body. This must be kept under beaten black and blue, beating his own flesh. The apostle here, Paul, is talking about beating our own flesh, literally, like doing whatever we have to our flesh to keep it in submission to our spirit or to our mind, to make sure that we don't sin. As the combatants were in the Grecian games, and thereby brought into subjection. So it's just comparing them to the Grecian games. By the body we are to understand fleshly appetites and inclinations. These the apostle set himself to curb and conquer, and in the Corinthians were bound to imitate him. Note that those who would pursue the interests of their souls must beat down their bodies and keep them under. They must combat hard with fleshly lust and not indulge a wanton appetite, and long for heathenish sacrifices, nor eat them to please their flesh at the hazard of their brethren's souls. The body must be made to serve the mind, not suffered to lord over it. So again, Matthew Henry here is saying the body must be made to serve the mind. The flesh must be made to serve the spirit. We must take our sinful desires, beat them however we can, and make them serve the Spirit of Christ that lives within us. This is from the Bible Exposition Commentary. An athlete must be disciplined if he is to win the prize. Discipline means giving up the good and the better for the best. And that stuck out to me as well. It means giving up the good and the better for the best. There's lots of good things. The song, there's a song by Tripley, Christian rapper. It's the title of the song is Heart Problem, and in it the opening line of it is money, sex, and power are good. And it's the basic premise of the song. It's a great song. If you haven't heard it, I'd say go check it out on YouTube or whatever. But the basic premise of the song is that money, sex, and power are gifts from God. They are wonderful things. The problem is when they become something for us to use for our own personal sinful gain, that they become an issue. And it's still not even those things in and of themselves that are the problem. It's our hearts. It's our sinful, fallen, lustful flesh that desires pleasure for ourselves. That's when those things become an issue. And I just thought that was such a poignant comparison there as far as giving up the good and the better for the best. Continuing on. The athlete must watch his diet as well as his hours. He must smile and say, no thank you, when people offer him fattening desserts or invite him to late night parties. And I want to stop there for a second. I don't know how many of you out there struggle with food like I do. I for those of you who don't know, I used to weigh nearly 400 pounds. I'll post a picture of that at some point in time. And, I actually, in my willpower, I still struggle. I still struggle with eating properly and exercising as I should. And I lose a lot more than I win in those fields, I guess you would say. And it took surgery. It took a radical surgery for me to be rid of that weight. And I think just like the radical surgery required for me to get rid of my weight, it takes a radical surgery of the heart for us to be able to even begin to fight against our sinful flesh. And that is what happens when we are regenerated. God gives us his heart, and we then start to seek out and desire holy, righteous, God-honoring things, though we still struggle with those sinful things that we used to do more often, hopefully less often now. There's nothing wrong with, continuing on now, there's nothing wrong with food or fun, but if they interfere with your highest goals, then they are hindrances and not helps. The Christian does not run the race in order to get to heaven. He is in the race because he has been saved through faith in Jesus Christ. Only Greek citizens were allowed to participate in the games, and they had to obey the rules both in their training and in their performing. Any contestant found to be breaking the rules was automatically disqualified. In order to give up his rights and have the joy of winning lost souls, Paul had to disciple himself. That is the emphasis of this entire chapter. Rights must be balanced by discipline. If we want to serve the Lord and win his reward and approval, we must pay the price. I'm reminded of Jesus saying, if you desire to follow me, you must bear your cross. And that, again, is unfortunately not something that some Christians take seriously. And I didn't for many years. I was a false convert until I was 25 years old. We need to be ready to give up these things, these painful things. I'm preparing in the next couple of weeks to actually go on a very, very strict diet, which, by the way, I could definitely use prayer for. I'm going to try and remove a lot of gluten and dairy out of my diet after a meeting with a nutritionist. And so that is something that I'm going to have to keep in mind and fight with for a long time is I need to discipline my body. I need to beat my flesh. I need to tell my stomach, no, I don't care how much you want a grilled cheese sandwich or whatever it might be. I need to do what's right for my body so that I might better serve God. And that's a sacrifice that Christians, I think all of us have some area in our lives where we know that we need to do a better job in that. And that's the very difficult thing to accomplish. Moving on now, this is from Webersee, I believe that's how you pronounce it, Webersee's Expository Outlines in the New Testament. If athletes can give up their rights in order to win a fading olive leaf crown, certainly Christians can lay aside privileges to win an eternal crown. Only one athlete could win each event as the Isthmian Games, but all Christians are given the opportunity to win Christ's approval. And that's, I think, the ultimate goal of every believer is we want to win Christ's approval. We all want to be there at the end of our days, bowing before Christ. This is how I picture it, at least, bowing before Christ. Whatever body or spirit I happen to have at the time. And just hear, have him put his hand on my head or shoulder or whatever it might be and say, well done, Neil. Well done. It even right now kind of puts a little lump in my throat, just hoping and praying and looking forward to that day. But, you look at some of the radical things that athletes go through to achieve these things. They'll go on strict diets. They'll go and they'll commit to lifting weights and studying game film, and their whole lives are wrapped up. And what is the ultimate prize they can win? It's like the Lombardi Trophy, or NASCAR's Cup. Or sorry, I'm not a big NASCAR fan. I don't really find driving straight and turning left to be all that enthralling. My apologies to any NASCAR fans out there. But they're these. Ultimately, it's a hunk of metal that they're getting, and they do this for a hunk of metal. And ultimately, I know there's other things going along with it. There's the, kind of the glory and camaraderie that go along with it. But these things are nothing compared to the glory and compared to the joy of serving Christ and hearing those words is going to be. I mean, if athletes are going to do it for that, Christians can do the same thing for God. And we should be able to do it better because our prize is infinitely better. I'd take Christ's approval over a Lombardi trophy any day, no matter how much I love my Seahawks. So we need to keep that in mind, that our prize is not going to rust or be stolen. It is secured for us, and we should fight tooth and nail for it with love and compassion. Moving on. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down. And I begin to think of things that might get in the way of, say, prayer time or Bible reading or reaching out to our neighbors, just whether it's boredom or fear or pride or whatever it may be. Let us strip off those things. Let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion, who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Now he is seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. Think of all the hostility he endured from sinful people. Then you won't become weary and give up. After all, you have not yet given your lives for your struggle against sin. That one hit me too. We have not given up our lives in our struggle against sin. We have not yet died struggling against sin. And that to me is just how seriously we have to take this. I mean, Paul here is saying that, you haven't died yet. You still got more to do. You still can fight against sin. It's not like, oh, you're tired, oh, you can sin. Oh, you're hungry, oh, you can sin. Oh, you're very sexually tempted, oh, you can sin. No, we haven't given up our lives yet. We haven't struggled to the point of death. That's how seriously this is. Moving on now to a verse from 2 Timothy 4, verse 7 through 8. Paul again saying, I have fought the good fight. This is toward the end of his life now. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race, and I have remained faithful. And now the prize awaits me, the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on the day of his return. And the prize is not just for me, but for all who eagerly look forward to his appearing. And again, I just think back to that day when we're standing before Jesus, and how all the struggles, all the hardships, all the temptation, all the sin will just wash away. And we'll be standing there in front of Christ, awaiting our prize. So I think really, if you're going to sum up how to win the race, or how should we run to win, I think if you had to sum it up in one word, that word would be discipline. Discipline. What spiritual disciplines should we focus on? What disciplines are American Christians in general lax on, myself included? And I think discipline really starts with a state of mind, like determination. And you'll have to forgive another football mention here, another football analogy, but when you go back and you watch some of the really tough-nosed running backs like Walter Payton, and really kind of more of a modern-day example might be like Steven Jackson, or my Seahawks running back Marshawn Lynch, these guys never give up. If you watch them run, they hit the line and they don't stop. They don't hit the line and go, oh, it's tough, I'm just going to kind of stop. No, their legs keep moving. Their legs keep moving. And if you want to see a run that personifies determination and discipline, go back and look at Marshawn Lynch's run against the New Orleans Saints in the playoffs back in January of 2011. That was just an incredible run. He broke, I think, about 8 tackles, pushed people off. But not only that, the beautiful thing about that run, Matt Hasselbeck, the quarterback for the Seahawks at the time, was all the way down there blocking for Marshawn Lynch, like 40 or 50 yards downfield. And I think that's a beautiful analogy that we can look at. We can see that when we are determined to run, we will inspire others around us, and others around us, other believers around us, will want to come around and help us. And we, in turn, will want to turn around and help them. And so I just want to remind all of you that we don't run this race by ourselves. when we are determined and when we show how badly we want to honor and glorify God, other believers are going to come around us, and we will encourage one another as the Spirit works through all of us. But we can't give up. We can't keep our legs still. We got to keep our legs churning. We got to keep pushing. We got to keep moving through this adversity that we'll end up inevitably facing. We can't stop. And there's a couple of things that I wanted to look at here, a couple of statistics I found from some Barna reports. From, I think it's barna.org, or the barna.org. And there were some startling statistics, and this one hits me square in the face because of my struggle with food. But 80% of the population in the United States claims to be Christian in some either denomination, form, or unfortunately subcult that you might call Christian but really don't hold to Orthodox views. And 35% of Americans are obese. So at minimum, we have a 15% overlap of Christians who struggle with obesity. And again, I'm not pointing the finger at anyone else because I have enough to point at right at myself. And I think that's one area where the church especially, I think, can be a little lax on it. We love, our potlucks and our meals together, and amen, those are wonderful things. It's a wonderful time of fellowship, and there's something about sitting around a meal with other people where there's a spirit in the group that's just joyful and wonderful, and that's wonderful. Amen to that. That's great. But we need to really take these, even what we might call respectable sins, which Jerry Bridges has a fantastic book by that name, Respectable Sins. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. It'll really, really make you look at the sin in your own life through a whole new lens. We have to take those little sins seriously as well. I mean, we tend to think of sins in America as, the what we might call, and I'm using my finger quotes here, the big ones. Like lust, adultery, pornography, violence, things like that, those sins that are very overt and very unanimously bad or wrong. But we need to look at the other areas of our life too. And diet and exercise is definitely one of them. I would say another one, especially in America, is that we're materialists. A lot of us are. And again, I'm pointing the finger directly at myself. I went and I bought an iPad this summer, and, it's been great and I've loved it and it's been very handy, but I didn't need it. Now, I don't necessarily know if that would be a sin in and of itself. I mean, these things are a blessing from God, and I'm thankful for them. But there are times where it definitely takes over my attention, where I could be spending time in prayer or reading scripture or, loving my neighbor or helping my neighbor or whatever. And because I'm so entertained and enthralled by this gizmo, I don't. And so and I'm sure I'm not the only one out there who suffers with things like that. So I'd say we need to look at that also. One that I felt really convicted of lately, though, is lack of prayer. My discipline and lack of prayer, I'm not running the race well in my prayer life, and I'm suffering because of it. I think that I'm actually, to get, I guess, a tiny bit personal here, I've actually felt a little farther from God recently, even though I've been, so happy and so enjoying doing this podcast and this ministry and things at my school and whatnot. But I've actually felt somewhat farther from God. And so if you have time, I would really appreciate prayer for that I would really seek to be disciplined and to spend more time in prayer with God. Heartfelt prayer, not just, typical, saying I'm thankful for this, I repent of that, etc., but really connecting and just spending time with God. But Americans, 80% of us pray at least once a week, which I think is great. But something that's a little sad and tragic, I think, is that if 80% of Americans are praying once a week, why is our country continuing to move away from Christian values? And I think a big part of that is because there's so many cultural Christians or people who would call themselves Christians who don't really have a saving relationship with Christ. And, how shallow are some of those prayers? I know mine were very shallow before I was saved, and I know they're still somewhat shallow sometimes. Like, hey, God, help me pass this history test back when I was in college. Or God, if you could, have the rapture, before this math test in high school, that would be fantastic. These very self-serving prayers. But if 80% of Americans are really praying that much, we should be increasing in holiness and godliness, but we're not seeing that. We're seeing a continual move away from Orthodox Christian beliefs, an increase in sin, an increase in acceptance of, many truths, and that, I think, just goes to show how shallow or undirected American prayer is. Something else I felt that would help us run to win would be fasting. Fasting is spoken about a few times in Scripture, and when it does, it has some powerful results. And I think that's a discipline that would be really good for us to really go over again. In fact, now I'm thinking about it, I might dedicate a show in the future to fasting, because I think it can be that powerful. Then also evangelism. I'm going to beat this drum till the day I die, but if we really believe that Jesus Christ is the only way to heaven, and we're not actively, either at the very least, praying for people to know Christ, I would really, really encourage you to look at your heart. I don't know how, as believers, if we think that people are dying and going to hell, and we don't have the slightest concern for other people in that area, I would really question the conversion of somebody at that point, if they're not at least desiring that for other people. I think that is something that is really underaddressed in our church is outreach. Not necessarily in my church specifically. I'm not speaking. I just meant the church in America in general. We need to have a soft heart for people, and we need to stop worrying about, as my pastor said today, smelling funny to people. In other words, we act differently or we talk differently, and people think we smell funny. Or and smell obviously here is just a metaphor, but we have some sort of difference about us that's kind of a turn off to other people. We need to stop worrying about that. We need to stop worrying about that, and myself included. I know that I still worry, especially at work. I want to reach out to my coworkers sometimes. And part of me is like, well, I don't know if that's really appropriate at work. And part of me is like, if you're worried about these people, you got to say something to them. And I desire to. I desire for all my coworkers, to know and love Jesus Christ and to be saved. So, and then also I would say Bible reading. And these are where the statistics to me were fascinating. So again, another Barna study. Bible reading during a typical week drops as age drops. So 59% of seniors read the Bible during a typical week. 43% of builders, I'm not sure what that is considered, but it must be between seniors and boomers, because the next one is boomers. 39% of boomers read during the week. 29% of busters read the Bible in a typical week. And again, I'm not sure what busters are, but it just must be the generation after the baby boomers. And this was from 2001. An estimated 75 million adults, 42%, said that reading the Bible is very important to them. This was from 1997. So 42% said that reading the Bible is very important to them. And yet we see many people in the 29% range. And I think probably if you look at youth, it's even lower than that. Among Bible readers, the average amount of time spent reading the Bible during an entire week is 52 minutes. How much time do we spend texting, reading stuff on the internet, watching TV, going to movies, whatever else? And yet, on average, we're only giving 52 minutes a week to reading the love letter that God has sent to us. And again, I'm pointing at myself. I should be doing more. I don't want any of this to sound like I'm accusing you or I'm some sort of super Christian, because I fall short in many of these as well. But this is something that I think we should take a good hard look at ourselves on. There's much, and this is continuing on now with the Barna study, there's much misunderstanding about the history of the Bible. For instance, 4 out of every 10 adults, 38%, believe that the entire Bible was written several decades after Jesus' death and resurrection. While this appears to be true for the New Testament, the entire Old Testament was written hundreds of years prior to the birth of Christ. Almost 2 out of 3 adults know that the book of Isaiah is in the Old Testament. Only 1 out of 10 people believe it's in the New Testament. 1 out of 4 aren't sure. 12% of adults believe that the name of Noah's wife was Joan of Arc, which I thought was kind of funny and sad at the same time. 1 out of 6 people, 16%, believe that one of the books in the New Testament is the Book of Thomas, written by the Apostle Thomas. Another 1/3 of the population aren't sure whether or not there is such a book in the New Testament Bible. Half of adults, 49%, believe that the Bible teaches that money is the root of all evil. And that's obviously not biblical. 1/3, 37%, disagree with this contention. The actual teaching indicates that it is the love of money that is the root of all evil. A majority of adults, 56%, are convinced the Bible proclaims the single most important task in life is taking care of one's family, which, while obviously a good thing, we know that our number one thing is to glorify God, to live for Him. And I would argue that close behind that would be number 2. Obviously number 2 would be right behind it, but I think right behind that would be evangelism. I mean, the last thing Christ said to us in the Great Commission was, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creatures and to all nations. And my thought, and I've said this time and time again, but if I know I'm only going to see my wife or my dad or my brother or sister or whatever only one more time, the thing I tell them, and if I know it's the last time I'm going to see them, that's going to be pretty important. That's going to be an important thing. So I think Christ here shows how important it is by saying, look, this is the last time I'm going to see you in this form, at least until you pass. Here's what I want you to do. Go preach the gospel. Go share the gospel. Go share the new good news. And how many of us are really doing that with any purpose? So, for me, just kind of a summation, I know that my personal application for this lesson is I've got to watch my diet and my exercise and my eyes. And like I said earlier, I think every guy can sympathize with me on this where, lust, especially visual lust, is everywhere. And, praise God, I have a beautiful, loving wife. But I think every guy can still struggle with that from time to time. And, I'll be praying for all of you, and I would appreciate prayers for me. We can all stumble. None of us should ever feel that we're so spiritual that we can't trip and fall into sin. Satan's been doing it for thousands of years into much better men than you or I. If David can succumb to adultery, any of us could. We should never get too proud where we think we're not going to trip and fall into that. Something else, one last verse, Hebrews 12:4. We have not yet given our lives in our struggle against sin. We aren't dead yet. We can still do more. If we're still alive, if you're listening to this right now, God has more to do through you and with you and to you. I would encourage both you and me to find some quiet time and just say, God, what do you want me to do from here? What do you want me to do? Do you want me to continue where I'm going now? Do you want me to change paths? Should I reach out to my neighbor? Should I go help at a homeless shelter? Should I go do this or go do that? Spend time with him. We're still alive, which means God still has work for us to do. And He wants to do work through us. And how awesome that is. That the God of the universe, even though He could snap His fingers and it would be done, instead desires to have the work done that He wants done through us. That is just awesome. That is absolutely awesome. Well, that's all I have for running the race. If you have some comments on this, I'd love to hear your follow-ups on this. If you think I missed something that you think I should comment on or whatever else, I'd love to see that. Please leave a comment either in the comment section on this post or on the Facebook page, or you can get a hold of me on Twitter. It's just @EIE Radio. And the Facebook page is facebook.com/EIE Radio. I also want to let you know, if you know about Christian ministries or the Christians that inspire you, please let me know about them. Tell me about them. I want to use this platform to glorify God, obviously, but also to show people what other believers are doing and what amazing things God can do through, just average, everyday people. I'd also encourage you to go to the webpage and on the right-hand side, sign up for the newsletter. It'll keep you up to date with what happened in the past month and what might be happening in the future with EIE Radio. And then also, I would encourage you to come back. We have some interesting interviews lined up. Ben Petrick, who is a former Major League Baseball player who was slated by many people who said he was going to be a future Hall of Fame catcher, a 5-tool player, has an incredible story about his fight with Parkinson's. So I'm going to be interviewing him sometime soon and talking about his faith, which I'm really looking forward to. I'll also be talking to a ministry called 19 Upstream. They make Christian t-shirts, but it's more than just the cotton that they're doing something with. They're actually including Bible studies with these shirts so that people are prepared when they have these shirts how to share the gospel with people who might mention something about it. So that's going to be neat. And then also I'm going to talk with Gospel Echoes based out of Tangent, Oregon. I went down there last weekend and was able to do an outreach in a prison down there, which was just really, really neat. And so I wanted to interview the managers of that ministry down there and to let you know more about them. So until next week, everybody, stand for truth, reach the lost. Take care.